On July 8th, 1497, four ships left the port of Lisbon in Portugal. They were not large ships. The flagship, the São Gabriel, was crewed by about 60 men. Their captain was a man named Vasco da Gama. He was 28 years old. His mission was simple to state, but nearly impossible to achieve. He was to sail to India, not by crossing the Mediterranean and trekking overland. He was to do it by sailing south around the tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. No European had ever done it before. The reason for this desperate voyage was sitting in kitchens all across Europe. It was black pepper. For centuries, Venice had controlled Europe's access to spices. Venetian merchants sailed to ports like Alexandria in Egypt. There, they bought pepper, cloves, and cinnamon from Arab traders. These Arab traders had their own complex supply chains, stretching back through the Red Sea and across the desert to the Indian Ocean. Each middleman added his own markup. By the time a peppercorn reached a market in London or Paris, its price had increased by a factor of 1,000 or more. Pepper was worth more than its weight in gold. A sack of it could buy a house. A single peppercorn could pay a toll or a tax. Venice grew fantastically rich on this monopoly. The rest of Europe grew resentful. The Portuguese crown wanted to cut out the middlemen. All of them. They wanted to sail to the source and buy the pepper themselves. That source was the Malabar coast of India. Da Gama's voyage was a state-sponsored attempt to break the Venetian monopoly and seize control of the world's most lucrative trade. The journey was brutal. Da Gama's men sailed for months without seeing land. They faced storms, unpredictable currents, and the terrifying unknown of the South Atlantic. The biggest killer was not the sea, but what happened on the ships. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, ravaged the crew. Men's gums swelled and rotted. Their teeth fell out. Old wounds reopened. Limbs swelled and turned black. Out of 170 men who left Lisbon, fewer than 60 would see it again. After 10 long months, on May 20th, 1498, they finally dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, India. Da Gama had made it. He had found the source. He went ashore to meet the local ruler, the Zamarin. The meeting did not go well. The gifts Da Gama brought, things like wool cloth and wash basins, were laughed at by the wealthy Indian court. They were used to trading for gold and silver. The Arab merchants who controlled the port saw the Portuguese as a threat and worked to undermine them. Da Gama managed to acquire a small cargo of spices, enough to prove his point. He sailed for home. The return journey was even more deadly than the voyage out. But when his battered ships finally limped back into Lisbon in 1499, the cargo they carried, small as it was, paid for the entire expedition many times over. The profit was estimated to be 3,000%. Vasco da Gama had done more than just complete a voyage. He had fired a starting pistol. He proved the all-sea route to India was possible. The Venetian monopoly on pepper was broken, and the city's slow decline began. Portugal, a small country on the edge of Europe, became a global superpower, building a vast maritime empire. The age of European colonial expansion in Asia had begun. It was a new era of trade, of exploration, of conquest, and of war. And it was all sparked by a desperate hunger for the tiny, black, dried berries that you probably have in a grinder on your kitchen table. Number 10. A peppercorn could buy a man's freedom. In the year 408 AD, a Visigoth king named Alaric stood outside the walls of Rome. His army had the city surrounded. Rome was starving. Alaric was not there to burn the city, not yet. He was there to get paid. He sent his terms to the Roman Senate. He demanded all their gold, all their silver, and all their valuable furniture. He also demanded the freedom of all slaves of barbarian origin. And then he made one final, specific demand. He wanted 3,000 pounds of black peppercorns. The Romans were stunned. The gold and silver they understood, but the pepper was a sign of just how valuable the spice was. It was not a garnish. It was treasure. It was a form of currency as stable and as coveted as any precious metal. The Romans scraped together the ransom, stripping temples and melting down statues. They delivered the gold, the silver, and the thousands of pounds of pepper. Alaric took his payment and, for a little while, left them in peace. 2 years later, he would return and sack the city, an event that marked a turning point in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But that first demand for pepper shows where the spice ranked in the minds of men. It was on the same level as gold. This tiny wrinkled berry comes from the Piper nigrum vine, which is native to the Malabar coast in southwestern India. For thousands of years, this was the only place on Earth it grew in abundance. The vine climbs trees, producing long drooping spikes that fill with green berries. These berries are picked, cooked briefly in hot water, and then left to dry in the sun for several days. As they dry, they shrivel and turn black, becoming the peppercorns we know. The journey from a vine in India to a Roman table was long and dangerous. It involved multiple stages and multiple groups of traders. Indian or Indonesian sailors would carry the pepper on ships across the Indian Ocean, guided by the monsoon winds. They would sell it to Arab traders at ports on the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. From there, the pepper had to be carried over land. It was loaded onto camels and traveled in vast caravans across the deserts of Arabia and Egypt. These caravans were at constant risk from bandits and raiders. They had to pay taxes and tolls to local rulers for safe passage. Finally, the pepper would arrive at a port on the Mediterranean, like Alexandria. There, it would be sold to European merchants. For centuries, the undisputed masters of this final leg of the journey were the Venetians. The Republic of Venice built its entire fortune on controlling the European spice trade. They had the ships, the connections, and the ruthless business sense to dominate the market. They bought the pepper from the Arabs and shipped it to their warehouses in Venice. From there, it was sold to merchants from all over Europe at a price that was often 100 times what the Venetians had paid for it in Alexandria. The price was high, not just because of the long journey and the many middlemen. It was high because people were willing to pay it. In medieval Europe, food was often bland and monotonous. There was no refrigeration, so meat was often preserved with salt, and it could be on the verge of spoiling by the time it was eaten. Pepper did not just add flavor. It helped to mask the taste of slightly off meat. It was also believed to have powerful medicinal properties. Doctors prescribed it for everything from stomach aches to the plague. They followed the theories of ancient Greek physicians like Galen, who believed the body was governed by four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Pepper was considered hot and dry, and it was used to balance out illnesses caused by an excess of cold and wet humors. But beyond its taste and its supposed health benefits, pepper was the ultimate status symbol. Having pepper on your table showed everyone you were rich. It was a way to display wealth as surely as wearing silk or jewelry. The wealthy would have elaborate spice cellars, and they would use pepper in almost every dish, sweet and savory. Ancient cookbooks from the period are filled with recipes that call for huge amounts of spices. It was a form of conspicuous consumption. You were showing you could afford to literally eat your money. The word pepper became slang for money or wealth. Rents were sometimes paid in peppercorns. A peppercorn rent today means a very small nominal fee, but back then it was a real and valuable payment. The power of pepper was so great that it drove nations to desperate acts. The Portuguese, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, began to systematically explore the coast of Africa in the 15th century. They were looking for gold, for a mythical Christian king named Prester John, and for a way to get to the source of the spices. They wanted to bypass Venice and the Arab traders entirely. This quest took decades. It cost countless lives and fortunes. Bartolomeo Diaz finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving there was a sea route to the east. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed that journey. When da Gama returned with his cargo of pepper, the world shifted. The old trade routes that had existed for millennia began to wither. The wealth of Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt began to drain away. The new nexus of power was Lisbon. The Portuguese used their naval power to seize control of the Indian Ocean. They built forts, captured port cities, and ruthlessly attacked any Arab or Indian ships that tried to trade without their permission. They created their own monopoly, one based on cannons and warships. The price of pepper in Europe did drop, but not by as much as one might think. The Portuguese crown simply replaced the Venetians as the ones getting rich. This single spice reshaped the map of the world. It funded the Renaissance, fueled the age of exploration, and was a direct cause of the first wave of European colonialism. It all came from a desire to control the trade of a small black berry that grew on a vine on the other side of the world. The same berry that sits in your pantry waiting to be ground over a salad or a steak. Number 9, a tree so valuable its homeland was kept a secret for centuries. For more than 1,000 years, a small group of islands in what is now Indonesia held one of the world's most valuable secrets. These were the Maluku Islands, or the Moluccas, known to Europeans as the Spice Islands. On just a handful of these tiny volcanic islands, Ternate, Tidore, Moti, Makian, and Bacan grew the world's entire supply of clove trees. The clove tree, Syzygium aromaticum, is an evergreen that produces small, reddish-brown flower buds. These buds, when picked and dried, become cloves. Their intense, pungent aroma and flavor were unlike anything else. Ancient civilizations knew of cloves, but few knew where they came from. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote about them in the 1st century AD, but he had no idea of their origin. In a clay tablet found in Syria, dating back to 1721 BC, mentions cloves, showing just how long they have been traded. In China during the Han Dynasty around 200 BC, court officials were required to chew cloves before speaking to the emperor to sweeten their breath. The secret of their origin was jealously guarded by the Arab, Malay, and Chinese traders who controlled the early trade. They sold the cloves in ports in India and the Middle East, but they never revealed the location of the islands where they grew. They spun fantastic tales of dangerous beasts and treacherous seas to discourage anyone from trying to find the source. This mystery, combined with the immense difficulty of transport, made cloves astronomically expensive in Europe. Like, pepper cloves were used to preserve food, add flavor, and as a status symbol, they were also a key ingredient in medicine. Clove oil is a natural anesthetic, and it was used for centuries to treat toothaches. It was believed to improve eyesight, cure indigestion, and even ward off the plague. During outbreaks of the Black Death, wealthy Europeans would wear pomanders, small ornate balls filled with cloves and other spices, hoping the aroma would protect them from the disease. When the Portuguese, led by Afonso de Albuquerque, captured the strategic port of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula in 1511, they finally found sailors who knew the way to the Spice Islands. The Albuquerque sent an expedition of 3 ships under the command of Antonio de Abreu. They were the first Europeans to reach the Banda and Maluku Islands. They had found the source. The Portuguese quickly established a foothold, building a fort on the island of Ternate. They tried to create a monopoly, but they were not strong enough to completely control the region. They were in a constant state of conflict with the rival sultanate on the island of Tidore, which was often aided by the Spanish. For most of the 16th century, the Portuguese dominated the European clove trade, making immense profits. But in the early 17th century, a new and far more ruthless power arrived in the East Indies, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Founded in 1602, the VOC was not just a trading company, it was a state within a state, with the power to wage war, build forts, sign treaties, and establish colonies. Their goal was not just to trade for spices, but to control their production completely. They wanted a total iron-fisted monopoly. The Dutch systematically drove the Portuguese and Spanish out of the Spice Islands. They did this with superior ships, more money, and a level of brutality that was shocking even for the time. Their primary enforcer was a man named Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen, the Governor General of the VOC. Cohen believed that trade could not be conducted without war, nor war without trade. To secure the clove monopoly, he decided that production had to be concentrated in one place that the VOC could easily control. He chose the island of Ambon. To make this happen, the VOC implemented a policy called extirpati, or extirpation. VOC soldiers went to all the other clove-producing islands like Ternate and Tidore and systematically destroyed every single clove tree they could find. They hacked them down and burned them. Local people who depended on the clove harvest for their livelihood were left with nothing. Any islander caught growing, hiding, or selling cloves without the VOC's permission was executed. The Dutch created a clove scarcity which drove prices in Europe through the roof. They paid the Ambonese growers a fixed, very low price and sold the cloves in Amsterdam for a massive profit. For nearly 150 years, the Dutch monopoly held. They went to incredible lengths to protect it. They even doused all cloves destined for export in lime water, supposedly to prevent the seeds from being fertile if they were planted. It was a closed system, and it made the Netherlands one of the richest countries in the world. The man who finally broke the monopoly was a Frenchman named Pierre Poivre. His last name, fittingly, is the French word for pepper. Poivre was an adventurer, a botanist, and a French government official. He was obsessed with the idea of introducing spice cultivation to the French-controlled islands of Mauritius and Reunion in the Indian Ocean. He saw it as a way to enrich France and break the Dutch stranglehold. He made several risky voyages to the East Indies. He tried to bribe locals and smuggle out seedlings, but his early attempts failed. The Dutch were vigilant, and the seedlings often died on the long sea journey. Finally, in 1770, on a clandestine expedition, Poivre succeeded. He managed to obtain not only clove seedlings, but also nutmeg plants. He smuggled them off the islands and successfully transported them to Mauritius. The trees grew. Within a few years, the French had established their own clove plantations. The secret of the Spice Islands was out for good. From Mauritius, clove cultivation spread to other parts of the world, like Zanzibar and Madagascar, which are major producers today. The Dutch monopoly was shattered, and the price of cloves began to fall slowly, making them accessible to more than just the super rich. Every time you use a clove to stew a baked ham or spice a pumpkin pie, you are using a bud from a tree that was once the source of immense wealth, the cause of brutal wars, and the object of a century-and-a-half-long corporate monopoly. Number 8. An island was traded for a city because of this spice. In 1667, diplomats from England and the Dutch Republic met in the city of Breda to end a war. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had been costly for both sides. They needed to make peace. As part of the treaty, they agreed to a swap of colonial territories. The Dutch would keep a small, remote island in the East Indies that the English had recently occupied. So it was called Run. The English, in return, would get to keep a swampy fur trading settlement they had captured from the Dutch in North America. That settlement was called New Amsterdam. Today, we know it as Manhattan. At the time, the Dutch believed they had gotten the better end of the deal. They had traded a piece of North American wilderness for an island. That was, in the 17th century, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. Run was one of the Banda Islands, and the Banda Islands were the only place in the entire world where the nutmeg tree grew. The nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, produces a fruit that is the source of 2 different spices. When the apricot-like fruit ripens, it splits open to reveal a single dark brown seed. That seed is nutmeg. Covering the seed is a bright red, lacy membrane. That membrane, when dried, becomes mace. Both were highly prized in medieval and Renaissance Europe, but nutmeg was the true star. Like other spices, it was used in cooking and as a status symbol. But nutmeg had a special reputation. It was believed to be a miracle cure, a preventative for the most feared disease of the age, the plague. During waves of the Black Death, the price of nutmeg in Europe skyrocketed. A single nutmeg nut could sell for enough to buy a house or set a person up with a pension for life. People wore sachets of nutmeg around their necks, hoping it would ward off the disease. Whether it worked or not was irrelevant. The belief that it did was enough to make it one of the most valuable commodities on earth. The Arabs and Venetians controlled the early nutmeg trade, and like with cloves, they kept its origin a secret. When the Portuguese found the Spice Islands, they discovered the Banda Islands, a tiny archipelago of about 10 small volcanic islands. This was the source. The Portuguese tried to control the trade, but it was the Dutch VOC that truly set its sights on a total monopoly. What happened in the Banda Islands is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the spice trade. The Bandanese people had traded their nutmeg and mace for centuries. They operated a free market selling to Javanese, Chinese, and Arab traders. They were happy to sell to the Europeans too, but they refused to sell exclusively to one party. This did not sit well with the VOC. The VOC's Governor General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen arrived in the Banda Islands in 1621 with a fleet of ships and nearly 2,000 soldiers. His goal was to enforce the VOC's monopoly by any means necessary. He demanded the Bandanese leaders sign a treaty giving the VOC exclusive rights to their nutmeg. When they resisted, Cohen unleashed his forces. He started by executing 44 Bandanese village leaders, or Orang Kaya. His soldiers then swept across the islands. They systematically slaughtered the local population. They destroyed villages and crops. Thousands were killed, many others were captured and sold into slavery, some fled to the mountains where they starved to death. Others tried to escape to neighboring islands in canoes, but many were hunted down or drowned at sea. Before the Dutch arrived, the population of the Banda Islands was around 15,000. Within a few months, it was less than 1,000. Cohen had effectively wiped the native population off the map. To replace them, he divided the land into plantations called perken and gave them to Dutch planters known as perkeneers. These planters used enslaved labor brought in from other parts of Asia to cultivate and harvest the nutmeg. The VOC bought the entire harvest at a fixed, low price and sold it in Europe for profits that were often over 1,000%. It was a monopoly built on genocide. The only island the Dutch did not initially control was Run. The English had established a small outpost there and had a treaty with the locals. This tiny island became a major point of contention between the two rival powers. For decades, the Dutch and English fought over it. The Dutch blockaded the island, preventing the English from resupplying their men. Eventually, the English were forced to abandon it. This history is what made the island of Run so important at the treaty table in Breda. The Dutch were obsessed with controlling every last nutmeg tree. They were willing to give up their claims to a promising North American port to secure that final piece of their monopoly. The Dutch monopoly, like the one on cloves, lasted for more than a century, and it was also broken by the Frenchman Pierre Poivre. On his 1770 expedition, when he smuggled out the clove seedlings, he also managed to get nutmeg plants. He successfully cultivated them on Mauritius. A few years later, in 1778, a cyclone hit the Banda Islands, and many of the nutmeg seedlings were swept out to sea. They washed up on the shores of other islands, helping to spread the plant further. The monopoly was over. Today, nutmeg is grown in many parts of the world, from Indonesia to the Caribbean island of Grenada, which is now one of the largest exporters. The spice you grate over eggnog or into a bechamel sauce is a direct descendant of the trees that caused a small nation to commit mass murder and led to a remote island being traded for what would become the financial capital of the world. Number 7. This bark was more valuable than gold. Long before Europeans sailed the seas in search of spices, the Arab traders who controlled the overland routes had a problem. They were the middlemen for one of the world's most desired commodities, cinnamon. They needed to protect their source and justify their high prices. So they invented stories. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded what the Arab traders told him. He wrote that cinnamon sticks were brought to Arabia by giant birds. These birds, they claimed, built their nests with cinnamon sticks on treacherous, inaccessible cliffs. To get the cinnamon, men would leave large chunks of fresh meat, like ox limbs, on the ground below the cliffs. The giant birds would swoop down, grab the heavy meat, and carry it back to their nests. The weight of the meat would break the nests, causing the cinnamon sticks to fall to the ground where the men could collect them. Another story claimed that cinnamon grew in a remote land guarded by winged creatures, like bats, that would attack anyone who tried to harvest the bark. These stories were, of course, complete fabrications, but they served a purpose. They discouraged rival traders from trying to find the source of the cinnamon themselves. They also created an aura of magic and danger around the spice, which helped to justify its astronomical price in the markets of Athens and Rome. For centuries, the true origin of cinnamon was one of the best kept secrets in the history of trade. The real source was not a mythical land of giant birds, but the island of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. The Cinnamomum verum tree, which means true cinnamon, is native to the island. The spice is the tree's inner bark. Harvesters skillfully peel off the outer bark of the tree's branches, then carefully scrape away the inner layer in long, paper-thin strips. As these strips dry, they curl into the familiar cinnamon sticks or quills. A cheaper, more pungent version of the spice, called cassia, comes from a related tree in China and Southeast Asia, and much of what is sold as ground cinnamon today is actually cassia. But for centuries, the delicate, complex flavor of true Ceylon cinnamon was the most sought after. Cinnamon was one of the first spices to travel from east to west. It is mentioned in the Old Testament where Moses was commanded by God to use it in a sacred anointing oil. The ancient Egyptians used it in their embalming processes. The Romans burned it at funerals. The Emperor Nero is said to have burned a year's supply of the city's cinnamon at the funeral of his wife Poppaea as a sign of his remorse for having killed her. Like other spices, its value was tied to its rarity, its use in medicine, and its role as a status symbol. It was believed to cure everything from indigestion to the common cold. Its sweet, warm flavor was perfect for both savory meat dishes and sweet desserts. The wealthy used it lavishly, while the poor could only dream of it. When Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama broke into the Indian Ocean, finding the source of cinnamon was a top priority. In 1518, the Portuguese landed in Ceylon and quickly realized they had found the cinnamon heartland. They used their superior military power to take control of the island's coastal areas, and with them, the cinnamon trade. They established a fort in Colombo and imposed a harsh regime on the local Sinhalese population. The king of the inland kingdom of Kandy was forced to pay the Portuguese an annual tribute in cinnamon. The Salagama caste, who were the traditional cinnamon peelers, were forced into servitude. They had to provide a certain quota of cinnamon bark to the Portuguese every year. If they failed to meet the quota, the punishments were severe. The Portuguese monopoly was brutal and exploitative, but it made them incredibly rich. For a century, they controlled the flow of cinnamon to Europe. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch arrived, eager to add cinnamon to their growing spice monopoly. They allied with the King of Kandy, promising to help him drive out the Portuguese. After years of fighting, they succeeded. In 1658, the Dutch captured Colombo and took control of the cinnamon trade. But they did not liberate the Sinhalese. Instead, they imposed an even stricter and more efficient system of exploitation than the Portuguese had. They expanded cinnamon cultivation and enforced their monopoly with ruthless efficiency. The Dutch held Ceylon for about 150 years. Then, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British took over the island in 1796. By this time, however, the cinnamon monopoly was already beginning to break down. The Dutch themselves had started to cultivate cinnamon trees in other parts of their empire, like Java. The British tried to maintain control of the trade, but the secret was out. Cinnamon could be grown elsewhere. As cultivation spread, supply increased and the price began to fall. By the 19th century, cinnamon was no longer a luxury item for the super rich, but a common spice available to almost everyone. The bark that was once guarded by mythical birds and controlled by warring European empires now sits in a jar in nearly every kitchen, ready to be sprinkled on toast or stirred into coffee. Number 6. A war was fought over a stolen shipment of flower stamens. In the autumn of 1374, a shipment of one of the world's most precious commodities was making its way up the Rhine River Valley towards the city of Basel, Switzerland. The cargo was not gold, silver, or jewels. It was about 800 pounds of dried purple flower stigmas. It was saffron. As the merchants and their cargo passed by the castle of a local nobleman, a baron named von Ramstein, he and his knights rode out and seized the entire shipment. This was not an ordinary act of highway robbery. The saffron was so valuable and its destination in Basel so important that the city declared war on the baron. For 14 weeks, the people of Basel laid siege to his castle. This conflict became known as the Saffron War. Eventually, the baron was defeated and the saffron was recovered. The incident shows just how seriously people took this spice. Stealing, it was an act of war. Saffron is by weight the most expensive spice in the world. Its value comes from the insane amount of labor required to produce it. Saffron comes from the crocus sativus flower. Each flower produces only 3 tiny thread-like red stigmas. These stigmas must be harvested by hand, carefully plucked from the flower during a short 2-week blooming season in the autumn. It takes about 75,000 crocus flowers to produce a single pound of dried saffron. An area the size of a football field will yield only a few pounds of the spice. Its origins are a bit of a mystery, but it is believed to have first been cultivated in or near Greece during the Bronze Age. While frescoes from the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, dating back to 1600 BC, depict people harvesting crocuses. It was used as a dye, a perfume, a medicine, and a spice. Cleopatra was said to have bathed in saffron-infused milk. Alexander the Great used it to treat his battle wounds. The Arabs introduced saffron to Spain in the 10th century, and from there its cultivation spread to other parts of Europe. It was especially prized for its brilliant golden yellow color. In an era before synthetic food coloring, saffron was the only way to give food, like bread and rice, a rich, golden hue. This color was associated with the sun, with gold, and with royalty. A dish colored with saffron was a dish fit for a king. Its medicinal uses were also legendary. It was prescribed as a cure for melancholy, a digestive aid, and even as an aphrodisiac. During the Black Death, demand for saffron soared, as it was believed to be a powerful tonic against the plague. This huge demand, combined with the labor-intensive production, made it incredibly valuable. Its price was often equal to or greater than that of gold. Because it was so expensive, saffron was a prime target for adulteration. Unscrupulous merchants would mix the real saffron threads with other cheaper materials. They would use threads from the safflower, sometimes called bastard saffron, marigold petals, or even shredded colored paper or corn silk. To increase the weight, they might coat the threads in honey or oil. This fraud was taken very seriously. In some parts of Europe, special inspectors were appointed to check the quality of saffron sold in the markets. The punishments for selling counterfeit saffron were severe. In Nuremberg, Germany, in the 15th century, a special code called the saffron shoe was established to regulate the saffron trade. Anyone caught selling adulterated saffron could be fined, imprisoned, or even burned at the stake, along with their counterfeit goods. The Saffron War in Basel was not just about a stolen shipment, it was about protecting a vital economic interest. In cities that were centers of the saffron trade, like Basel, Valencia in Spain, or Saffron Walden in England, a town that got its name from the spice, depended on it for their prosperity. The spice trade eventually shifted as new, cheaper colorants and flavorings became available from the New World, like turmeric and annatto. Saffron's dominance as a dye faded, but it retained its place as a luxury spice in cooking. Today, Iran is the world's largest producer of saffron, accounting for over 90% of the global supply. But the painstaking hand-harvesting method has not changed in thousands of years. It remains the world's most expensive spice, a reminder of a time when the threads of a small purple flower could be worth more than gold and could even be the cause of a war. Number 5, the spice that became a man. Sometime in the 16th century, at the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England, guests were treated to a whimsical new creation. They were small, baked cookies spiced with ginger and shaped like people. These were some of the first gingerbread men. The Queen had them made to resemble important guests and dignitaries. It was a novelty, a fun treat for the wealthy. But the main ingredient, ginger, was anything but new. It was one of the oldest and most familiar of the exotic spices. Ginger, the knobby, pungent rhizome of the Zingiber officinale plant, has been cultivated for so long that its wild ancestor is unknown. It originated in maritime Southeast Asia and was one of the first spices to be exported from the region. It traveled with Austronesian sailors as they spread across the islands of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. By the 1st century AD, it was a common item of trade in the Roman Empire. Unlike pepper or cloves, which remained luxuries for the rich, ginger became relatively widespread. It was still expensive, but it was more accessible than many other Eastern spices. The Romans loved it. They used it extensively in their cooking and for its medicinal properties. Ginger is a powerful remedy for nausea and indigestion, a fact that was well known to ancient physicians and is still recognized today. The Romans imported it in large quantities from India via the Red Sea trade routes. After the fall of the Roman Empire, trade with the East became more difficult, but ginger never completely disappeared from Europe. The Arab traders who controlled the spice routes continued to bring it overland, and it remained a staple in the kitchens of medieval monasteries and noble houses. By the 11th century, it was well known throughout England. A pound of ginger was said to have the same value as a sheep. It was a key ingredient in many medieval recipes. It was used to flavor wine, preserve fruit, and spice both meat and sweet dishes. The concept of gingerbread, a hard ginger-spiced biscuit, was popular across Europe. It was often pressed into elaborate molds and decorated with gold leaf for festivals and fairs. The value of ginger was such that it was a key driver of the age of exploration. You know, when Vasco da Gama reached India, ginger was one of the spices he was specifically looking for. In the centuries that followed, as the Portuguese, Dutch, and English fought for control of the spice trade, ginger was always a part of the prize. The Portuguese established trading posts in India to control the ginger supply. They even tried to transplant it to West Africa, but the quality was not the same as the ginger from the Malabar coast. One of the less known aspects of the ginger trade was the distinction between different types of processing. The most valuable ginger was scraped or peeled ginger, where the outer skin was removed before drying. This produced a cleaner, more refined product, cheaper, unscraped. Ginger was also sold. The quality and origin of the ginger could have a big impact on its price. Unlike cloves and nutmeg, which came from a single tiny corner of the world, ginger was more widespread. It was cultivated across India, China, and Southeast Asia. This made it impossible for any one power, even the mighty Dutch VOC, to establish a complete monopoly. There were always alternative sources. When the Spanish and Portuguese began exploring the New World, they took ginger with them. They found that the plant grew exceptionally well in the Caribbean. By the mid-16th century, Jamaica was exporting large quantities of high-quality ginger back to Europe. This was a major shift. For the first time, a traditional Asian spice was being produced in the Americas on a commercial scale. This new source of supply further increased its availability and helped to lower the price, making it even more of a common household spice. The journey of ginger is a story not of a secret, guarded monopoly, but of steady global expansion. It was one of the first spices to connect the East and West. It traveled ancient trade routes, helped fund empires, and crossed the Atlantic to find a new home. The gingerbread man, that simple, happy cookie, has a history that stretches back thousands of years to the very beginnings of the global spice trade. He is a humble figure, but he is made from a root that helped shape the world. Number 4, the golden spice that fooled gold diggers. When the Venetian explorer Marco Polo was traveling through China in the late 13th century, he encountered a plant that puzzled him. He described a vegetable that had all the properties of true saffron, as well as the smell and the color, and yet it is not really saffron. He called it Indian saffron. What he was describing was turmeric. Turmeric, the bright golden yellow powder ground from the rhizome of the curcuma longa plant, is a close relative of ginger. It has been used in its native India for at least 4,000 years. It is a cornerstone of Ayurvedic medicine and a fundamental ingredient in Indian cooking, providing the characteristic yellow color to most curries. It was also used as a powerful dye for cloth, especially for the robes of Hindu and Buddhist monks. It traveled from India along the same ancient trade routes as pepper and ginger. It was known to the ancient Greeks and Romans, but it was never as highly valued as the other major spices. Its flavor is earthy and slightly bitter, less spectacular than the fire of pepper or the sweetness of cinnamon. Its primary value in Europe was as a cheap substitute for a much more expensive spice saffron. As Marco Polo noted, turmeric provided a brilliant yellow color, just like saffron. For a cook or a dyer on a budget, it was a perfect alternative. It became known as the poor man's saffron. This led to widespread fraud. Unscrupulous merchants would mix turmeric powder with expensive saffron to bulk it out and increase their profits. For this reason, for a long time, turmeric had a somewhat down-market reputation in Europe. It was the spice of imitators. The story of turmeric is less about epic wars for control and more about trade, identity, and mistaken value. When European explorers first arrived in the Americas, they were on a desperate search for gold. They were also looking for the spices of the East. In the process, they often misidentified the plants and minerals they found. Columbus thought he had found Asia, and he called the native people Indians. He found chili peppers, and thinking they were related to the black pepper of India, called them peppers. A similar case of mistaken identity happened with turmeric. European traders, particularly the Spanish, were obsessed with finding sources of gold. When they encountered turmeric in Asia and later in the Caribbean where it was introduced, its brilliant golden color was deceiving. It was sometimes referred to as a golden spice, and there are accounts of it being mistaken for a sign of gold deposits in the soil. The real value of turmeric, however, was not as a fake saffron or a false sign of gold. Its value was in its own right. As trade between Europe and Asia increased, more and more turmeric began to arrive. It became a common ingredient in European products. It was used to color mustard, giving French's mustard its iconic bright yellow hue. It was a key ingredient in the original Worcestershire sauce and is a component of many pickle brines. But its greatest impact was in the development of curry powder. In the 18th and 19th centuries, British officials and traders returning from India wanted to recreate the flavors of Indian food back home. Indian cooks use a complex, often personal blend of spices called a masala, which is typically made fresh for each dish. This was too complicated for most British kitchens, so British companies created a pre-mixed standardized blend of spices that they called curry powder. The primary ingredient, the one that gave the powder its signature color and earthy-based flavor, was turmeric. This invention made Indian-style flavors accessible to a mass audience in Britain and around the world. The scientific understanding of turmeric has also changed its status. In recent decades, researchers have been studying curcumin, the main active compound in turmeric. It has been shown to have powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. This has led to a massive surge in its popularity as a health supplement. The spice that was once dismissed as a cheap substitute is now celebrated for its unique medicinal benefits. It has gone from being the poor man's saffron to a modern-day superfood. Its journey shows how the value of a spice can change over time, based not just on taste and rarity, but on culture, commerce, and science. Number 3, the Queen of Spices guarded by Vikings. In the 9th and 10th centuries, a fearsome group of Scandinavian sailors and warriors began to appear in the towns and monasteries of Europe. We know them as the Vikings. Their reputation was for raiding and plunder, but they were also something else. They were prolific traders. Their longships, capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers, connected a vast network that stretched from Iceland in the west to the Byzantine Empire and the caliphates of the Middle East. And along these routes, they carried furs, amber, slaves, and something surprising spices from the Far East. One of the spices that found its way to the cold lands of Scandinavia was cardamom. Known as the Queen of Spices in its native India, cardamom comes from the seeds of several plants in the ginger family. It has a complex aromatic flavor that is at once minty, citrusy, and smoky. It was highly prized in India and the Middle East, used to flavor coffee, rice dishes, and sweets. How did this exotic Eastern spice become a staple in Scandinavian baking? The answer lies in the Vikings' eastern trade routes. While some Vikings sailed west to raid Britain and explore the Atlantic, others, known as the Varangians, sailed east. They traveled from the Baltic Sea down the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, like the Volga and the Dnieper. They established trading posts and even ruled over local Slavic populations. Their ultimate destination was the richest city in the known world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They called it Miklagard, the Great City. Constantinople was the western terminus of the Silk Road and the spice routes. It was a bustling marketplace where goods from all over the world were bought and sold. Here, the Viking traders would sell their northern goods: furs from squirrels and martens, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory, and slaves captured on their journeys. In return, they bought luxury goods to take back home: silk, wine, jewelry, silver coins, and spices. Among those spices was cardamom. The Vikings developed a taste for it. They brought it back north, along with other spices like cinnamon and cloves. When they returned to their homelands in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, they brought not just the spice itself, but also a taste for Eastern luxury. This is why, even today, cardamom is a key ingredient in Scandinavian baking. It is used to flavor pulla, a Finnish sweetbread, and the Swedish buns called kardamombuler. This culinary tradition is a direct legacy of the Vikings' role as international traders. The journey of cardamom to the north was long and difficult. An Indian or Arab merchant would carry it to a port on the Persian Gulf. From there, it would travel by caravan to the markets of Baghdad or Damascus. Then it would travel further north to Constantinople. There, a Viking trader would buy it, load it onto his ship, and begin the arduous journey back up the rivers through a series of portages where the ships had to be carried overland and across the Baltic Sea to Scandinavia. By the time a cardamom pod reached a Swedish kitchen, it had passed through countless hands and traveled thousands of miles. Cardamom was known in Europe before the Vikings. The ancient Greeks and Romans used it primarily for perfume and in medicine. But it was the Vikings who seem to have popularized its culinary use in Northern Europe. There are two main types of cardamom: green and black. Green cardamom is the more common and highly prized variety, with a delicate aromatic flavor. Black cardamom has larger pods and a more intense, smoky flavor. Both come from the Malabar coast of India and Sri Lanka, the same region that produced black pepper. For centuries, the trade was controlled by the same networks that handled the other major spices. When the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, they took an interest in the cardamom trade, but it never became the object of the same kind of vicious, monopolistic warfare as cloves or nutmeg. This is partly because its primary markets were in Asia and the Middle East, not Europe. While Europeans enjoyed it, they did not have the same insatiable craving for it as they did for pepper. The story of cardamom is a more subtle one. It is not about vast colonial empires and brutal monopolies. It is about cultural exchange. It is the story of how a taste for an Indian spice was carried by Viking traders to the far north, where it took root and became part of a national cuisine thousands of miles from where it grew. Every time someone in Stockholm enjoys a cardamom bun with their coffee, they are tasting a piece of the Viking Age and the vast, interconnected world of medieval trade. Number 2. The spice Columbus found by mistake. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain with 3 small ships. His goal was to find a new westward route to the East Indies, the source of the world's most valuable spices. He was looking for pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. He was financed by the Spanish crown, which was desperate to break the Portuguese and Venetian grip on the spice trade. Columbus was convinced the world was smaller than it was and that he could reach Asia by sailing across the Atlantic. He never found Asia. Instead, he ran into a massive, unknown continent. But he was a man driven by his mission, and he was determined to find the riches he had promised his royal patrons. He was especially obsessed with finding pepper, which the Spanish called pimienta. On his second voyage, while exploring the islands of the Caribbean, he found a tree that produced dark berries with a pungent aromatic flavor. He believed he had found a type of pepper. He called the berries pimiento. He was wrong. The berries he found were not related to black pepper at all. They came from the pimenta de oca tree, which is native to the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica. But the name stuck. The spice became known as pimento, and to this day, the trees dried. Unripe berries are often called pimento berries. When the spice was brought back to Europe, it was given another, more descriptive name, allspice. People who tasted it found that its complex flavors seemed to combine the tastes of several other familiar spices. It was like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves all in one. And so it became allspice. This was a New World spice, one that was completely unknown to Europeans, Asians, and Africans before Columbus's voyages. Its story is not one of ancient trade routes and secret sources, but one of discovery, misidentification, and the massive global exchange of plants, animals, and cultures that began in 1492, an event known as the Columbian Exchange. The native Taino people of the Caribbean had used allspice for centuries. They used it to flavor food and also to preserve meat. They would rub a mixture of allspice and salt onto meat and then smoke it slowly over a fire of pimento wood. This method of cooking is the origin of what we now call barbecue or jerk in Jamaica. The Spanish were initially more interested in finding gold and silver than in developing a trade for a new spice. But they did begin to use allspice in their own cooking, incorporating it into sausage and other meat dishes. For a while it was primarily used in Spain, but in the 17th century the English captured Jamaica from the Spanish. They soon realized the commercial potential of the allspice trees that grew wild all over the island. The English began to export allspice to Britain and its North American colonies. It became very popular, especially in England, where it was used in puddings, cakes, and for pickling. Unlike the Asian spices, which had to be brought on a long and dangerous journey around Africa, allspice could be shipped relatively quickly and cheaply across the Atlantic. For a long time, Jamaica held a natural monopoly on allspice. Attempts to grow the tree in other parts of the world failed. People would plant the seeds, but they would not germinate. The secret, it turned out, was birds. In Jamaica, birds would eat the allspice berries. The seeds would pass through the bird's digestive tracts, and this process, called scarification, would break down the seed's tough outer coating, allowing them to sprout after they were excreted. Once this was understood, it became possible to cultivate allspice in other places with similar climates, like Mexico and parts of Central America. But Jamaica remains the world's premier producer of high-quality allspice. The story of allspice is the story of an accident. It was found by a man who was looking for something else. It was named after a spice it was not related to. It became popular because it tasted like a combination of other more famous spices. It is a symbol of the profound and often unexpected consequences of the age of exploration. It brought a new flavor to the world, one that had been used for centuries in one small corner of the globe, and introduced it to kitchens everywhere. The search for the old spices of Asia ended up revealing a new one from America. Number 1, the seed that built a papal fortune. In the 14th century, the city of Rome was in chaos. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1376, the popes, the leaders of the Catholic Church, abandoned Rome and established their court in the city of Avignon in southern France. The Avignon papacy was a period of immense wealth, luxury, and political power for the popes. They lived like kings with lavish feasts and vast retinues, and one of their favorite flavors was mustard. Pope John the 22nd, who reigned from 1316 to 1334, was a particular connoisseur. He loved mustard so much that he created a new position at the papal court, Grand Moutardier du Pape, or Grand Mustard Maker to the Pope. He gave this prestigious and lucrative job to his nephew, who, the story goes, had no real qualifications for the role other than being the Pope's nephew. This papal obsession with mustard helped to cement the reputation of a nearby French city, Dijon. The city became the center of mustard production in Europe, a status it still holds today. The mustard makers of Dijon developed a specific style using verjuice, the acidic juice of unripe grapes, instead of vinegar, which gave their product a smoother, less harsh flavor. Mustard is different from the other spices on this list. It is not an exotic import from a distant tropical land. The mustard plant grows readily all over Europe. It has been used as a food and medicine for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all cultivated it. The Romans were the first to create the condiment we know today. They would crush the tiny mustard seeds and mix them with unfermented grape juice, called mustum. The mixture was called mustum ardens, or burning must, because of the heat of the seeds. From this Latin name we get our word mustard. The Romans spread the use of mustard throughout their empire, including to Gaul, France, and Britain. After the empire fell, the cultivation of mustard was kept alive in monasteries. It was a common everyday spice. Unlike pepper or cloves, which were reserved for the rich, mustard was available to almost everyone. It was the spice of the common person. It could be grown in a local garden, and it provided a powerful, pungent kick to the often bland diet of the medieval peasant. So, if it was so common, why was it at the center of papal luxury and a major industry? Because while anyone could grow mustard, not everyone could make good mustard. The process of grinding the seeds and mixing them with the right amount of liquid to create a stable, flavorful paste required skill. Different regions developed their own styles. Some used honey, others used spices. The mustard makers of Dijon perfected their craft and created a product that was considered the finest in the world. They formed powerful guilds to protect their recipes and control quality. In 1634, the mustard makers of Dijon were given the exclusive right to produce mustard in the city by King Louis XIII. Mustard's heat comes from a chemical reaction. The seeds contain two compounds, sinigrin and myrosinase. When the seeds are crushed and mixed with a cold liquid like water or verjuice, the enzyme myrosinase breaks down the sinigrin, creating a volatile oil that contains isothianate. This is the compound that gives mustard its characteristic pungent heat. The temperature and acidity of the liquid used can change the intensity of the final product. Mustard was more than just a condiment. It was a vital part of the medieval pantry. Before refrigeration, meat was often heavily salted to preserve it. The strong flavor of mustard could make this salty meat more palatable. It was also, like every other spice, considered a powerful medicine. It was used to clear the sinuses, stimulate the appetite, and in plasters to treat chest congestion and aches and pains. The story of mustard is not one of exploration and colonial wars. It is a story of how a common, local plant could become a source of wealth and status through craft, regulation, and branding. The popes in Avignon and the kings of France did not need to send fleets around the world to get their favorite spice. They just needed a skilled nephew or a royal decree. It shows that even the most humble seeds, the ones you can find growing wild on the side of a road, can have a history tied to the heights of power and a lasting impact on the way we eat today.